Good evening, and welcome to our History, Theology, and Philosophy lecture series. Get over here and get this to we have been continuing our meetups, even though we're not meeting up in person, and continuing to explore a wide variety of topics under those general ideas of history, theology, and philosophy, those general fields, but obviously, hopefully, with an idea of exploring things that are meaningful in our lives today. My name is John Hamer, and I serve as the coordinator of the meetup. By background, I'm a historian, I'm a professional mapmaker, and also a theologian within my church, and I serve as pastor of Toronto Center Place, which hosts this lecture series. We always begin with Center Place's mission, which is to invite everyone into community, to continually learn and grow, to abolish poverty and end needless suffering, to promote peace and justice, and to live life meaningfully together. All of our ministries, all of our content that we live stream, and our archives, digital archives, are made possible because of your generous contributions. We are definitely listener supported, and if you want to support what we're doing, you can always go to our website, centerplace.ca. And your contributions are tax deductible in the US and Canada. Next week, our topic is a history of the end of the world. And specifically, we're going to look at people who read the book of Revelations, just every generation for thousands of years, and read it and think it's speaking directly to them in their time, and predict a calendar date for the world ending based on their particular reading, and actually what I'm going to suggest, misreading of the book of Revelation. So we're going to look at what the book actually says and the kind of the history of misreadings of it. And so I think it'll actually be quite an interesting lecture next week. Our topic tonight is the book of Job and the problem of evil. The problem of evil is probably the central theological question, and it is in fact like the out of all of the different philosophical and theological arguments against the existence of God, the problem of evil is probably the hardest one, or the most difficult one, to actually square everything with. And we'll look into why that is and try to get a sense of it, and we'll also look at how this theological question is being addressed all the way back in Old Testament times, the authors of the book of Job, and the different answers that they propose. And we'll look at how satisfactory or not those answers seem to be. So let's get into it just a little bit and get a sense of this question. So what is the problem of evil? So people ask often, why is life full of suffering? Why do bad things happen to good people? You did everything right, and yet somehow you seems like you're being punished in the world. Why do the righteous suffer? And on the flip side, why do the wicked prosper? Why are people who seemingly just rotten people seem to be very successful and maybe live a long and healthy and wealthy life, despite the fact that they, by all standards that we might think of, generally understood, they seem to be really quite awful people. If there is, specifically in terms of this problem, if there is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and there is perfectly good, why would such a God allow such a thing to happen, or why does the universe set up this way? So prior to the development of monotheism, prior to the sort of modern world religions that exist now, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, but also even, frankly, the other world religions that also address this, the religions of the old gods that existed before that didn't have this problem as much, because the explanation in a way is built in. If there are multiple gods, if every sort of force that you encounter, everything from let's say death to the river to lightning bolts, if every single one of those things is in fact a different god, it's possible to understand why even though you may well be doing good things, you may be getting off with one of these forces. So you may well be beloved of Neptune, but it may well be that Hera or Juno doesn't like you and has, a kibosh on you. And so paganism is always able to kind of make these kind of explanations of why you've been particularly cursed, why the fates or the furies are following you around, because there's multiple competing forces of chaos, and that was baked into that kind of a religion and religious explanation prior to, let's say, the development in antiquity of world religions. But what happens if, once you get past that? So what if the universe is orderly? So as people established orderly state societies with law, literature, as priests and philosophers began to observe, for example, the orderly movement of the heavenly bodies, and they could tell, wait a second, this isn't just all chaos. The sun and the moon, they're all doing these things in a very regular and predictable way. Those thinkers then began to speculate that the universe at its root might not be as chaotic as their ancestors had originally assumed, and in fact even that the universe has a prime mover or a central source, which is in fact a force of order, and they often speculated a force of good. And so if that's the case, though, that changes the equation in terms of why the problem of evil, why do the righteous suffer? So as that is developing early on, people come up with different early ideas. And so in the biblical era of when the Old Testament is being written by the Israelites, by ancient Jews, the central thesis of the section of the books that come after the Torah, after the 5 books attributed to Moses, is generally called by scholars the Deuteronomic histories. These are the books of Joshua, of Judges, of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Those form the kind of quasi or supposedly historic cycle of ancient Israel. So what the solution in terms of the thinkers who compose that text, what they always show in these cycles is that Israel or Judah prosper when the people turn away from paganism and idolatry, and instead they worship the God of Israel, the one God, Jehovah, Yahweh, in the temple in Jerusalem in a centralized setting. So in other words, in support of this sort of state monotheism. Israel and Judah then are punished in these stories when the people forget Yahweh and turn to other gods. So the problem of evil in this period, according to the Deuteronomic writers, the priests and prophets who wrote these texts of the Bible, the problem is in fact corporate, not individual. So they're not thinking about it in terms of why does an individual person suffer. They're actually saying, why does the people suffer? Why does the Israel suffer? Why does the tribe? Why does our kingdom suffer? And so Yahweh blesses the people and their king when the people turn away from idols and worship only Yahweh at his cult center at the temple in Jerusalem. That's the only place where the worship is allowed. And if in the course of your generation, if the Philistines or the Midianites or the Moabites, the Egyptians, whoever come in and attack and oppress the people, it's because they and their king, or earlier in the Judges period, they and the judges who have been ruling over them have turned away from the worship of Yahweh and have turned to idolatry, worshiping all of the different pagan gods of their Canaanite neighbors. And so in the way these legends are remembered in the biblical narrative, this always works. So the cause is very clear. It's turning to idolatry. God raises up a judge. The people remember. They turn back to Yahweh, and the Egyptians or the Philistines are vanquished. So it works in the let's say literarily. The problem is when we actually get to actual history, and so the Deuteronomic history is written towards the beginning texts of it probably are likely to be written towards the end of the first temple period, and so towards the reigns of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, and the final kings after it, right before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so when the Deuteronomists get to their own time and are writing about what happens, they encounter a problem. So, whereas out of those last three major kings, the wicked pagan king Manasseh, he's absolutely hated by the Deuteronomist who's writing the book of Second Kings, he actually ends up having the longest and most peaceful reign. So he has a very, here he is, he should be being punished according to how the Deuteronomic cycle works. But when they're actually living it out, it turns out that this wicked pagan guy, king who's reestablished all of the idols in the temple in Jerusalem and so on, nevertheless has a very peaceful and prosperous and long reign. By contrast, his father, who had been the righteous king Hezekiah faced a horrible attack by Assyria, and almost everything, the whole kingdom was devastated. They were able to hold it out, and the Assyrians are not able to, they besieged Jerusalem, but they're not able to actually conquer it. And so why is he being punished by the Assyrians, given the fact that he was such a righteous king who was eliminating all of the pagan idols and cults? Likewise, his righteous grandson, Josiah, who again got rid of all the idols and everything that Manasseh had put in, he just is inexplicably killed by Pharaoh at the age of 39. So why would the Egyptians be able to just kill off this king who had been so he's so honored by, he's like thought of in the text as being like unto David, and yet nevertheless he doesn't have a career like unto David. So that was already problematic in real life when the Deuteronomist was actually writing their history. It actually gets more problematic after the end of the First Temple period, after the Babylonian captivity, and after the exiles from Babylon. The Jewish nobles come back and refound Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. So after they get rid of idolatry entirely, all of the suffering remains. So the Deuteronomic answer, was that why do the people suffer? It's because they turn to idolatry. And that was maybe understandable or maybe possible when, in fact, during the First Temple period, the people of Judah were largely pagan in the sense that they were not only worshiping Yahweh, they worshipped multiple gods. However, when we get to the Second Temple period, this time period from 516 BC to 70 AD, paganism was largely extinguished. So the Jewish people at this time really do only worship Yahweh. So they do not worship Asherah and all the other gods that they had been worshiping previously. And so the problem is, though, if you think of the Second Temple period and all of the problems the Jewish people have in terms of the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Greeks, the Romans, Herod, this is not a time where there's no suffering for the people, despite the fact that they have done what God wanted, right? So other biblical authors, therefore, have to come up with, okay, what's the reason for this ongoing suffering? So in other words, what's another answer to the problem of evil? It's clearly not just whether we're idolatrous or worshiping Yahweh properly, because that obviously doesn't play out. And so in this Second Temple period, there are two more types of books that get added to the Bible, two types of wisdom books, where people are speculating about this or trying to come up with answers or solutions to both this issue and then other issues as well. And so these are divided into two types of wisdom books, and we'll talk about each one of these types. They're called either prudential wisdom or reflective wisdom. And so among the earliest of these is the book of Proverbs, which is actually multiple collections of wisdom sayings. Then the book of Job, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. Then the later books are Ecclesiastes, and then within the Apocrypha, within the Deuterocanicals, so what's not in the Protestant Bible, but in the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Bibles, the book of Sirach, which is also called Ecclesiasticus, and the book of Wisdom of Solomon, which are both, again, prudential, just like Proverbs. And so we'll talk about what all those are. So what's prudential wisdom? So the book of Proverbs is the key example of this. And so these are the kinds of pithy sayings that you remember. and that there are, it's the kind of thing like Ben Franklin, penny saved is a penny earned kind of thing. And so these sayings from Proverbs are such things as idle hands make for penury, diligent hands make for riches. Hate is always picking a quarrel, but love overlooks every offense. He who loves correction loves knowledge. He who hates reproof is stupid. To be patient shows great understanding. Quick temper is the height of folly. To the downtrodden every day is wretched, but to have a merry heart is a perpetual feast. Even a fool, if he keeps his mouth shut, will seem wise. So in a lot of cases, these may well be good advice, and everything like that. The problem sometimes is if you dig down a little too deep before these and take them as being always true, right? So just because if you're idle hands, you may well be, if you're not doing anything, you won't become rich. But just because you are diligently working, you could work a lot and still not be paid, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean you'll become rich, despite the Proverbs chapter 10 verse 4. So in general, though, the idea of prudential wisdom of these common sense saying, they're almost like the original memes, and so these things could just be made a meme and shared on Facebook, on social media. So it's like, look ahead, don't act rashly, have a good attitude, keep your mouth shut, these kind of good common sense things. It's actually part of a wider Near Eastern tradition. So Proverbs chapter 30 is subtitled A Collection of Agur, son of Jacob of Massa, which is a place in Arabia. So in other words, this is even wisdom that is coming from a non-Jew. So it's a person who's a wise man who is not an Israelite, it's an Arabian, right? Likewise, the section of Proverbs from the beginning or middle of chapter 22 through the middle of chapter 24 is actually totally dependent on an earlier ancient book of Egyptian wisdom called the Instruction of Amenemope. So anyway, that had been written centuries earlier and now gets changed and translated into Hebrew and brought in as if it's just part of this collection of proverbs that are supposedly from Solomon, but that's just anyway not the case. So the wisdom traditions, unlike what we see in the prophetic works, aren't actually focused on Yahweh. Then they're actually focused on wisdom and what to do to be wise, as opposed to focusing your religious devotion, right? And so the authors of the wisdom tradition were often at odds with the prophets, and the prophets didn't really like the people who were espousing the wisdom or writing the wisdom books. And so, for example, the prophet Jeremiah wrote concerning wisdom books, "How can you say, 'We are wise and the law of the Lord is with us,' when in fact the false pen of the scribes has made it into a lie? The wise shall be put to shame, they shall be dismayed and taken, since they have rejected the word of the Lord. What wisdom is in them?" So Jeremiah is saying, you really should be listening not to these guys who are talking about what's wise or not wise. What's really wise is listening to prophets like me, Jeremiah. And so, likewise, Isaiah, another important prophet in the Old Testament concerning wisdom books, wrote, "The Lord said, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their worship of me is a human commandment learned by rote. So I will again do amazing things with this people, shocking and amazing. The wisdom of their wise shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning shall be hidden." So Isaiah is not a fan here of the wise or of wisdom. Perhaps unsurprisingly, though, the wisdom does have an answer to the problem of evil, separate from what the Deuteronomists have. And for the wise, for the wisdom writers, the solution to the problem of evil is, in fact, wisdom. Wisdom herself. Wisdom is often personified as a kind of a female angel who is an aspect or attribute of God. So in Proverbs, wisdom declares, "The Lord, creating of his work, with the first of his acts long ago, blessed are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. Those who miss me injure themselves. all who hate me love death. So if you reject wisdom and teaching and being thoughtful about all these things, you're asking for death. So in Proverbs, like I say, is supposedly written by Solomon, although it's clearly not. But in any way, Pseudo-Solomon in Proverbs promises, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom. My child, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For long life and abundant welfare they will give you. So if you are listening to wisdom, you're going to get long life and welfare. So again, why are you avoiding? How do you be righteous in order to and avoid suffering? By following wise precepts. And so, blessed are those who find wisdom. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left is riches and honor. So it's pretty clear what they're suggesting here is that why do people prosper? Because they are following the precepts of wisdom. Why do you suffer? Because you've been dumb. So this is the kind of the basic answer that's in the beginning kind of wisdom literature, the earliest ones here in Proverbs. However, just in the same way that there were limitations of the solution offered by the Deuteronomists, in other words, idolatry isn't the answer for why suffering exists for Israel only, or specifically for individuals. Nevertheless, this is also a problem for wisdom. So if embracing wisdom and following her tenets yields health, wealth, and long life, the logical conclusion is that a person in poverty and poor health or who dies young is or was foolish. As wisdom said, as I read before, all who hate me love death. The problem of it is, of course, lots of people who are wise and smart and things like that nevertheless might die accidentally or through getting a disease or any other thing that wasn't of their fault. So as a result, there is a tradition then that disagrees with this kind of common sense prudential wisdom, and that's the reflective wisdom authors, people who wrote the books of Job and Ecclesiastes especially. And then we'll get back to the answer to those in the later ones with the new prudential books of Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon. So just to kind of show the difference, in Sirach here, which is one of those prudential wisdom stories or wisdom texts, Sirach writes, "Wisdom was the first of all created things. She built an everlasting home among mortals, and with their descendants she will keep faith." And so that's like essentially saying wisdom is, if you're going to follow in this path and be wise and do all these right things, wisdom is going to keep faith with you. You're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? Whereas in the reflective wisdom writers who think about it and who look at this stuff, like Ecclesiastes, they say, Ecclesiastes writes, "I have seen it all, from the righteous perishing in their righteousness to the wicked growing old in their wickedness." So the author of Ecclesiastes has said, you know what, I've seen some wicked people who've become really wealthy and very healthy and lived all long life too. So that's not the case. And whereas I've known some very righteous people who died very righteous, very young. Likewise, we hear in Job, "It is all one," the author of Job says, "therefore I say God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he, God, mocks the calamity of the innocent." That's a very strong, really critique of God here in the book of Job, in terms of the problem of evil, or identifying the problem of evil, which is to say, as we very well know, when disasters like are occurring, it's not that the pandemic is only taking down the wicked. In fact, unfortunately, there are all kinds of people who are the most affected who, not that anybody deserves it, but anyway, the point of it is that there's all kinds of innocent people that are hurt in calamities. So the book of Job is part then of this reflective wisdom tradition, and we want to look at that tonight so that we can see how the book of Job not only identifies the problem of evil, but how it presents a couple ideas, or tries to present its potential answers to the problem, or how these authors have worked through the problem. So, Job. Job is, who's the central character of the book, is among the Bible's most memorable characters, I think. Job is this long-suffering, patient man. He has kind of a nagging wife, and he has rotten friends. and through the course of this book, he's really quite badly mistreated by God. I want to look at the text as we now have it. We, if you've been with us for several of these lectures, you realize, or we've talked about how often happens in ancient texts. Texts are, in fact, combinations of texts that are come together by different authors, or have maybe been edited together by later editors, or maybe you have a little text and then a later writer comes on and makes it bigger. So we certainly have that with books like Isaiah, books like the Torah, books like the Gospels, at least Matthew and Luke, and probably John, where essentially you'd have a text that isn't by just one author, but in fact is a combination of perhaps smaller texts edited together into the final form that we have it. And we can see this pretty clearly because in the book of Job, because the seams are very stark. One of the ways that you can tell kind of it's very different parts or different seams is that at both the prologue, the first two chapters, and then the epilogue, the last chapter of the book, are in prose, and the whole rest of the text is in poetry. And so while it's completely possible for somebody to write that way, it's actually also fairly clear that there's a different voice going on, because what's attached at some point or other to the whole text is a beginning and an end that are not even poetry. It's actually a prose, anyway, prologue and epilogue that are appended. And then likewise, then we have, through the middle of it, several segments that are poems. First, Job's opening monologue, then kind of this long back and forth between Job and his three friends, which is a long argument that happens in 3 cycles. Then there is a kind of an aside, which is a poem or a hymn to wisdom, which is almost like its own out of the blue, completely other wisdom text that has gotten stuck in here that maybe doesn't even belong. Then we have Job's closing monologue, which is a poem. And then suddenly Job has a 4th friend who hasn't been mentioned before, and he comes and he has a bunch of speeches. And then finally there's this kind of amazing section where there's again in poem, God speaks from the whirlwind. And so anyway, I want to look at all of these different parts and maybe how they all came together. They're not all from the sources that it would have originally been. So let's try to make sense of this kind of crazy text. Biblical scholars on the text of Job agree that this is a problematic text as we now have it. So James Crenshaw argues, quote, more critical problems surround the book of Job than perhaps any other book in the Old Testament. So how does this craziness fit together, in other words? Randall McGraw-Helms calls the text as we now have it, quote, an incoherent, contradictory muddle. So the component pieces here are written by different authors at different times, and the seams are very evident but are also really problematic. And so we'll look at what we got going on here with this text. So first off, let's look at that beginning and the ending. So the prose, prologue, and epilogue, and God's speeches from the whirlwind are probably the most famous sections of the books, and they're also probably the last additions to the text. So this is the part you probably are aware of if you're aware of any of it, which is to say the setup at the beginning, as we'll go over it, and the end, and then this amazing famous speech from God when he's talking to Job from the whirlwind. So given that these sections have a very different answer to the problem of evil than the whole core of the rest of the book, the overall message of the text has been complicated by the fact that we include those. So the fact is that there was an original book that has a different sense and a different thesis even, and now these kind of famous framing devices are put on either side of it, which muddle that answer and meaning. So what's going on in the prose prologue? So the prose prologue here is says that the story is set in the merry old land of Uz. So Job is like like the wisdom writer in the book of Proverbs, in one of the collections of the book of Proverbs, is non-Israelite. He's a guy who's from the land of Uz, which is probably in Arabia, who was, quote, blameless and upright and devoted to God. So he possesses 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, many servants. So he's very well off, very prosperous. Obviously, he's called the greatest of all the people of the East. And he performs his own religious observances. And then, after he does all of the things that he's supposed to do for himself, he actually does extras for his children, just in case they're failing to do what their obligations are for God. So, given that that guy exists, we now have in the prologue a setting that is held in the heavenly court. This is one of our also ways, really, that we understand that this story of Job is not even meant really to be a historical story, but is rather like a play or a parable. It's a thought experiment. But in any event, one of the members of the heavenly court, a guy named the accuser, and the word here for accuser is the Satan, comes before Yahweh along with all the other divine beings. But this accuser, even though this is where we get the word Satan, is not really the incarnation of evil. So this is an idea of a person or a being that is part of the heavenly court, an angel, who serves Yahweh in this sort of pantheon before the idea of a cosmic devil has become into Second Temple Judaism, so it predates that. So the accuser here argues he's part of God's court. He's not off down in hell somewhere as God's terrible enemy or something like that. He's fairly respectful in terms of the conversation that he's having with God. So the accuser argues that Job worships Yahweh only because he's been blessed. So God is really happy about what a wonderful guy Job is. The accuser says, look, anybody who you give all that wealth and all those goats and oxen and things like that of course they're going to be nice and happy. They're happy that you bribed him, essentially. So Yahweh disagrees and says of Job, he's in your power. So you go ahead and prove it that it's not because he's gotten all these goodies. He'll still be blameless. He'll still be devoted to me, God, even if you took all that away. So, what ends up happening again in the prologue, Sabaean marauders, Chaldean soldiers, along with a firestorm and a whirlwind, kill all of Job's children and livestock. Job mourns, but he says, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So he doesn't reject God just because all of his children have been killed by firestorm, a whirlwind, and marauders. The accuser then argues, this isn't a sufficient test because Job still has got his health. Health's the most important thing. So Yahweh says, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life. And so then Satan inflicts loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Even Job's wife advises, just curse God and die. Guy, everything has gone wrong here. We were doing great, now you're doing terrible, everything's gone. Even your health, everything, just die and curse God. Later scribes, because this is such a to say curse God and die in the Bible is actually quite a strong and shocking phrase. This is a shocking text. Often scribes would change it to bless God and die, so that because they couldn't take what was even being said here. So Job replies, you speak as any fool would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? So Job understands that he's had all these blessings and now he's not, and and essentially it's his responsibility to be devoted to God regardless, come what may. Okay, so in the prose epilogue, so if we take that was what's happening at the beginning and that added text, and now here at the end, Job's three friends show up at the end of the prologue. And in the epilogue, God explains that they have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And so in the end, in the prose epilogue, Yahweh restores the fortunes of Job. He gives Job twice as much as he has before. He gets 7 new sons and 7 new daughters, and he lives to be 140 years old, so as long as any human's allowed to live. And there's no mention actually at that point of Satan and his wager, but in any event, that's how the prose epilogue ends. So the prose author then on the problem of evil, I'm going to argue here, is kind of like the prudential wisdom. So the prose author is technically really not addressing the problem of evil directly. The wager is meant to illustrate that truly wise people act righteously whether they're blessed or cursed in the short term. And his argument is that the righteous will eventually be rewarded with long life and posterity, which is what ends up happening in the end. And this is a point, though, I think, and many people think, excuse me, is undercut by, the part of this reward is replacement children, right? And so, I don't know, maybe it was people, you want to think that people in antiquity understood a lot more about the mortality of kids and that kind of a thing, but the idea that you could have children that had lived to adulthood and they all get killed by marauders and so on, and then it's just as good to have now replacement children. Anyway, it does seem to be kind of a hollow or problematic expression of trying to make this this author's point. There's another famous section then, right before the prose epilogue, is the God from the whirlwind section. So in one of the book's very harsh scenes, a final friend, Elihu, shows up, and he makes several speeches through chapters 31 and 37, arguing that God is too cosmically powerful to be questioned. God is so far above us that we can't even question what God is doing. As Elihu concludes, in chapter 38, it abruptly begins, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind." So there's really almost no lead up to this or an idea that this was ever going to happen. And so now we have a new section where it's God speaking to Job out of the whirlwind, which are poetic statements put into the mouth of Yahweh, which follow. But even though it says the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, the words don't really answer Job. So here's the cosmic God confronting Job. God says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Can you draw out Leviathan, the cosmic force of chaos, the sea monster, with a fishhook? Excuse me. Or press down its tongue with a cord? Were not even the gods overwhelmed at the sight of it? Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty?" So this is powerful speech, but I mean, obviously, I wrote here anyway, it's kind of like God being a real jerk to Job, because in fact, Job wasn't being a fault finder, really. The whirlwind author's argument is that mortals inherently lack the perspective to answer the question, why do the righteous suffer? And he doesn't actually attempt an answer. He's essentially saying God is too big, you can't see the whole plan. The author does not attempt the related theories like God acts to teach you or to test you, or that he's working for a greater good. He's just kind of saying it's too big for humans to understand. And that's kind of what the whirlwind author's answer to the problem of evil is. Okay, so the whirlwind speech, most scholars argue, is probably a late insertion. And why? So the reason why is that if, where we have this kind of amazingly eloquent argument by God in God's own voice in chapters 38 through 41, that argument that is being made is almost exactly the same as the argument in chapters 32 through 37 made by this unexpected fourth friend Elihu has made. So since Elihu's speech is just not very good and not very compelling, it's also probably a late insertion, since it's not mentioned in the prologue or the epilogue, and it's not mentioned among all the other talks that Job has with his friends. But it's also hard to imagine that the person who wrote that Elihu part would have bothered to make such a poor insertion if the text had already included the whirlwind speech, right? So it seems much more likely that the text existed as it is, that the author of the Elihu speech was upset with the text and wanted to make these additional arguments, so inserts it. And then later what happens is that the author of the whirlwind speech had the same problem and found this Elihu stuff totally uncompelling, and so wrote this much more powerful God out of the whirlwind speech, and so added that. And so that's why probably those are later components to add. Again, it's hard to imagine why the Elihu one would have come after if somebody had already written the whirlwind one. So Job had already actually understood the cosmic argument. So in response to his friend's first discourse in the central part of the text, Job actually acknowledged, how can a mortal be just before God, who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun, and it does not rise, who seals up the stars, who alone stretched out the heavens, and trampled the waves of the sea, who made the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, in other words, all the constellations, who does great things beyond understanding, and marvelous things without number. Look, he passes by me, and I do not see him. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. He snatches away. Who can stop him? Who will say to him, to God, what are you doing? So Job already, the original text already understands this cosmic argument, and so God doesn't actually have to show up to make it. Anyway, so what's the core component of Job? So I'm going to suggest that the original core component is this chapter 3, and then 4 through 27, and then 29 and 31. The core text, apparently, when it was first written, was so disturbing that multiple biblical authors and editors felt the need to revise the text and add to the text, which is why we have the Job that we have. And so I'm going to suggest the short answer is that the original text is a reflective wisdom text similar to Ecclesiastes, a text that really directly challenges the ideas and common sense and happiness, blithe thinking of prudential wisdom. So in some senses, the story of Job, this original one, is similar to a Babylonian poem written maybe 300 years before that, 900 BC or earlier, known as the Babylonian Theodicy, which is 27 dialogues between a righteous sufferer and his friend, at the end of which there's no divine answer. So in this text, the central part of the earliest part of Job, in a way, the dialogue is a dialogue between proponents of prudential wisdom and reflective wisdom. So Job's three friends spend the narrative cycle making the standard pronouncement of prudential wisdom, things that they could have just pulled directly out of the book of Proverbs. So Eliphaz, one of his friends, says, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? Their argument, extrapolating from the logic of prudential wisdom, is, look, Job is suffering, so he must have himself to blame. He must have done something wrong, and he needs to repent and stop it so that things will turn around, because that's how prudential wisdom works. However, insisting that he has lived a totally blameless life and followed all the precepts of prudential wisdom and has nevertheless experienced calamity, Job himself then poses a very powerful challenge to his complacent friends that they don't want to accept. Job's uncomfortable reflective wisdom argues that God, quote, God destroys the blameless and the wicked. The blameless are made to suffer, and the wicked are spared in the day of calamity. Which is something that he's observed, and he thinks to be the case, and it flies in the face of what the people who are reading Book of Proverbs say. Job has a really powerful then complaint on behalf of mortals. He says in Job 27:2, God has denied me justice. So this is a disturbing challenge for the providential wisdom, which is given without giving a new answer. So, because there isn't that answer, because the reflective wisdom identifies this problem and just brings it out and makes it very painful and obvious, that's one of the reasons why the other writers felt the need to add their own answers or their own understandings of it to the text. So why do the righteous suffer. So lots of answers aren't appearing in the book of Job that are maybe surprising to us if you are familiar with Abrahamic religions now, so Christian answers or Jewish answers today. So later answers that develop don't appear in the text. So there's no notion that the wicked are going to be punished in hell or that the righteous will be rewarded in heaven, because this idea doesn't exist yet in Israelite religion. So there's no sense that Job is going to go to heaven and that's when he'll be rewarded for all of this loyalty or anything like that. There's also no idea that God is responsible for good, and evil is merely lack of good, which is what St. Augustine taught, for example. God is responsible for good and is also allowing the evil, or is actually the cause of it here in the book of Job. Likewise, there's no idea where there's an argument that somehow free will is the cause here, that humans require suffering to develop as free moral agents in the likeness of God, which is what theologians like Irenaeus have argued, and is generally speaking one of the core answers throughout all of Abrahamic Christianity, Judaism, theological and philosophical exploration subsequently. This is all predating those ideas, and so they don't actually exist in the problem of Job, the evil. And so in that sense, what I would suggest is that that the solutions, that the Job as a thought experiment brings up the problem and shows it very clearly, but it doesn't actually include a fully satisfactory answer, which is one of the reasons why Christian thinkers have continued to, and Jewish thinkers have continued to wrestle with it ever since. So, so for a lot of people in the secular 21st century or increasingly secular society, maybe it's no big deal because maybe they don't believe in God anyway. So if there's no God, is there no problem? So one modern answer that is also unconsidered by the authors of Job is maybe there is no God. Maybe that's what it means. And so while I think that this may seem to solve the problem, I think it actually returns us to Plato's question, which is it good to be good? So why, if the wicked suffer, if everything's relative and people who do horrible things end up being amazingly successful, and people who do really good things end up having just horrible fates, does it make any sense to be good? Is it good to be good? Plato, of course, answers, two different kinds of yes. So even God or no, Plato definitely thinks, it is good to be good. But nevertheless, the question is open, right? So if good is only relative, by what standard do we say that someone is doing something bad, if bad is a behavior allows them to achieve results that are perceived as good from their perspective? So in that sense, I think this question is with us, no matter what your theological bent is. So that is my kind of brief thumbnail of what the problem of evil, but also how the book of Job answers it, and why its answers are so muddy as this interesting collection of texts evolved in the Second Temple period. So we'll see if people have any questions as a result of that. I mean, there was a lot of information maybe to take in, but if there are questions that people have written in. Okay. So there are some questions here already. So this is a comment, I think, as opposed to a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth writes, from Robert Frost's A Mask of Reason, God meets Job way off in the future and says, I've had you on my mind 1,000 years to thank you someday for the way you helped me. Establish once for all the principle that there's no connection man can reason out between his just deserts and what he gets. My thanks are to you for releasing me from moral bondage to the human race. I had to prosper good and punish evil. You changed that. You set me free to reign. You are the emancipator of your God. And God admits that he was just showing off to the devil. So that's a response certainly that you could have as a takeaway from this book, which does kind of, as a result of this muddle, and especially the prose editions of the prologue and the epilogue make it seem like he's just showing off in front of the devil in that way too. And so Robert Frost certainly has a point there. So YouTube user asks, when was the book of Job written? And so let's see if I can go back to the different sections here. I guess I didn't put the dates in any of this, did I? So it is all written during the Second Temple period and fairly early on. Maybe I put it. Let's see. Yeah, here. So maybe composed or getting to it's fairly early compared to things like Ecclesiastes or Sirach or Wisdom of Solomon. And so there are different components of it, as we've said, but maybe it's from as much as 400 BC. The different components would have also been written at different times. Yeah, so the earliest parts, Gordon points out, he thinks that, according to the New Oxford Annotated Bible, suggests that the earliest parts maybe were written as early as the 6th century. And so maybe the part here that I'm pointing out in the middle, if I can find my graph, of the blue parts here might be as early as the 6th century, and then the pink parts at the end, or the red part there, might be as late as the 4th century. And then there's a question: did Solomon write any books in the Bible? No, is the answer to that. So Solomon is the author. Anytime you wanted to write a wisdom book, like if you're Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes, the author of Proverbs, the author of Wisdom of Solomon, the best way to get your book, Solomon's known to be the wise king, right? And so the best way to get your book to be taken seriously is to attribute it to Solomon. Solomon is probably not a historical figure. We have there's nothing outside of the Deuteronomic histories to confirm Solomon's existence. Probably what's happened there is the temple that was a historical thing, the first temple, was at some point attributed to perhaps a Solomon, and so that's what would have been known, that there was a character, a historical figure that maybe was the founder of the temple who was named Solomon. And then the stories that are written about him are developed from the fact that they needed to talk about who built the temple. And so it's not a historical figure, probably, and certainly we don't have any writings from him. Are there any other questions that anybody has about all this? Including also the problem of evil? Okay. So there's a question from Bell. Are there any differences in Jewish versus Christian interpretations of the book of Job? There are so many differences in interpretations between everybody's interpretation of Job, because there will be there's going to be a vast difference between if you're, let's say, an evangelical Christian and you read like the Bible literally, and you therefore think that Job is a actual historical figure, and that Satan really was in the court of heaven talking to God and all these sort of things, that these are actually historical events. That's a very different interpretation than I think most. So that if you were a Reform rabbi, I think you would probably be pretty aware that this is a thought experiment as opposed to an actual, meant to be a historical text. A pretty big difference, I think, whenever I've talked, Jewish scholars are very aware of this kind of textual criticism that we're doing on the, I'm showing with this scroll here as we're focusing on component text and things like that. And yet I feel like that is happening more in progressive Christian and actually non-religious scholarship. So as people are doing this kind of textual criticism, and so looking for this kind of like I've done here, a text-based focus and doing textual criticism. So for this kind of critique or this kind of interpretation, what's always seems to be important from the kind of perspective that I have is I feel like in order to understand a text, I need to understand the context of the author and who the author is writing to. And so therefore that's why doing this kind of textual criticism to understand it is important, because if there's all these different authors and these different colors and they're writing at different times, and in fact they are writing to each other and arguing against each other because they in some cases are responding to the earlier text that they don't agree with, I think that's important for understanding the text. Whereas I think a lot of times what ends up happening in Jewish interpretation, because the worship is done in Hebrew and the knowledge of Hebrew is widespread, there is a much closer affinity with the original text and looking at it as a component whole, and what has it been and how has it been interpreted by the rabbis for thousands of years, and so I do think that there's a different way that the text is looked at and used between those two different kinds of traditions. It's a little inevitable because of again the focus on actually knowing Hebrew and being involved in the text, but also being involved in a millennia of rabbinic commentary and writing and dialogue about these texts that exist in Judaism. All right. One more? Okay. Just here we go. So Corey Bell writes, I never took Job seriously as a book until I read a great book called Rereading Job by Michael Austin. I had read Job, but I didn't understand anything about what was going on beyond the conclusion that Job got repaid in the end for his faithfulness. I heard in church, do other religious people avoid this book, or is it just Mormons? Well, no, I mean, I think it depends. So we're going to find that. So next week we're going to read the book of Revelation, right? And so the book of Revelation, I think in my church gets used zero, not at all, no. And so whereas there's some churches for whom Revelation, that's what all they care about, and they're very ready. They're prepping and they're ready to for the world to end like next year, and this kind of a thing. And so I think that can be the case, So if the book doesn't seem to make sense to what what your particular religion or sect within Judaism, Christianity highlights or promotes, they might just ignore it, right? And so in this case, like you say, a superficial reading of this thing, if you just read the easiest to understand parts at the beginning and the end, it has kind of a very unsatisfactory answer for the, as I said, right, kind of at the beginning, for the problem of evil. Since really, I mean, how big? Like I say, if all your kids are killed, then you get replacement kids. That's really not. That doesn't seem to make the point that the prose author wants to make. And so it's actually what's interesting to me in doing these kind of things and these dig deeps is I was way less aware in the core of the text just how stark kind of the criticism that Job, the author of the core book of Job here, is making about in kind of that the righteous here are being treated without justice by God. God isn't acting with this kind of justice. We've been taught that it was by reading the Deuteronomic history or by reading Proverbs, and yet here we all are aware that there's just horrible suffering. And I mean, within Judaism, the example is the Holocaust, right? And so that's how can that be justified? That kind of horrific suffering be allowed to have for innocent children and everything like that. So that is a strong text that exists within this, and I'm actually going to try to do a little bit of this kind of rehabilitation for Revelation next week by saying that really the problem with Revelation is that this book has totally been misinterpreted and is continuously misinterpreted in the same bad reading of it. That actually, if you read the text, it's clear that reading can't be held. So, Emma Gazarian writes, "Hi Emma, do you think viewing God as great and powerful is the problem? That God may have the power to prevent bad things happening?" I think it could be. So it depends. There's all kinds of different ways of how people are working on, have different understandings of this now. So there's this idea of process theology, of theology where that God is in fact, in some people's theologies, that God is weeping because these things can't be prevented, or God isn't able to do all of these, isn't able to stop suffering in all of these different ways. I would say from myself, certainly the as you point out, the God in the whirlwind, although it's a kind of an amazing speech that happens poetically, that I think part of the problem for me there is not seeing God as the super powerful force that's cosmically beyond what we can understand, but rather the anthropomorphic part where God is appearing as essentially a humanoid, a figure that looks very human and acts very human or talks very human, that envisioning God as being more or less a human being that has omnipotent powers. I think that is a problem for sure, for me anyway, especially. So we're also, I guess, one of the comments is that they have a great additional podcast for people who want to learn more about this. It's called The Bible for Normal People is the podcast. In episode 133 is his take on Job and what's going on there, and so that's one of our listeners here is Steve Otteson is suggesting that and that's in the links there. So if people want to take a listen to that. So thank you, Steve. All right. Are we good, Leandro? All right. Well, I thank you all once again, and hopefully you found this interesting. I certainly think that this is a difficult text to wrestle with, but this gives us a little bit of new ways to approach it, I think, and also for grappling with this core problem. We can only just scratch the surface of it, but there's plenty more to say about it in future lectures. And of course, next week we will try to do kind of the same thing for the book of Revelations. So we'll see you next week.